Okay, so this lecture is on the body of the speech, and we're only going to cover the body. There'll be separate lectures for the introduction and separate lecture for the conclusion. Okay, so the body of the speech is the core of the speech, right? This is where you tell them all the things, them being the audience, that you came here to talk about. All right, so to review, right, all speeches have three parts: introductions, bodies, and conclusions. The body of the speech is the core of our speech. It's the guts of the speech. It's what make us up. All right, so the body of the speech includes main points, which are our major points of the speech. These are like our largest elements of the speech. And then subpoints for each of the main points. A subpoint is the supporting material for our main points. So subpoints are where you're going to elaborate on your facts or evidence. This is your examples or your opinion. They should all support the main point, and the main point should all support the thesis or the purpose of the speech. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Let's talk about main points and subpoints a little more. All right, so let's talk about the body of the speech and specifically the main points. What are main points? Well, main points are the key pieces of information or arguments that are supposed to support the reason that you're giving the speech, right? They support your thesis. That's the whole purpose in giving the speech. All right. The main points should be very memorable. The audience should remember them. You're going to repeat them several times over the course of the speech, and so they should be very memorable. It should be easy at the end for your audience to be like, oh, these were the main points. So how do we make them both the key pieces of information and memorable? Okay. So the first thing is we don't want to overload main points, right? The number of main points that you have in a speech kind of depends on the amount of time that you have to give the speech. In general, a speech, any speech you're going to give over the course of your life is going to have between 2 and 7 main points, right? So if you're giving a really long, hour-long speech, you might have 7 main points. Whereas if you're giving a very, very short speech, there might only be 2 things that you really have time to say, right? So it sort of depends on the amount of time. In this class, our last 2 speeches, which will be our informative speech and our persuasive speech, will each have 3 main points. 3 is the magic number, 3 main points. All right, so let's make those main points then key and memorable. Main points need to be 3 things for all of your main points. The first thing is each main point must be critical. It must be essential to achieve audience understanding. So that means that there should be enough subpoint or supporting information to justify it being a core part. Think of it like a 3-ring circus, right? So each ring of the circus has like its own act going in it. And if your act isn't good enough to deserve its own ring, then you should put it in a different ring, right? And then you would only have a 2-ring circus. So each ring is like a main point, and it's going to have its own act, and that act is going to be critical or essential to the circus. All right? Essential to the circus. And if you look over here at my example main points, so here we have a speech on the Constitution, right? And the Constitution is of the people, for the people, by the people. All right? So each one is critical to the sort of understanding of the Constitution. We could come up with lots of these examples of things that are essential. The second thing that each main point has to have is it must be discrete. And I don't mean discrete as in like quiet or on the DL. I mean discrete as in separated. One main point cannot or should not be collapsed into another. Basically, we should not be able to logically combine your main points. They should each be their own core point of understanding, right? So they should each be essential, and they should each be discrete or not collapsible into. We should not be able to combine your main points. And the third thing is we want them to have parallel structure, which means that you word them using your delivery techniques in a way that makes them memorable. That's of the people, for the people, by the people is parallel structure, right? It repeats the same word structure. You could use alliteration to get the same word structure, right? Or you can just straight up use parallel structure or repetition of the same words. You could use antithesis to get something that is very much like a parallel structure. The idea is that what you're doing is making the three main points of your speech, or 2 or 7, however many you have in real life, memorable for the audience. Now you might be thinking, well, how will I be able to come up with main points, Tony? We only have like a week to write and perform these speeches. That's true, you do. But the good part for you is that there are some standard patterns or main point concepts that already exist. So like I said, we're going to learn some patterns or main points that already exist for like informative speeches. We're going to learn some main points that already exist for persuasive speeches. And it's kind of like walking into a tattoo parlor. You'll notice that when you walk into a tattoo parlor, there are tattoos that are already up on the wall, and that's because they're super common tattoos, right? Like there's a million people with a gigantic boat anchor tattooed to their arm or their leg, right? And that's why the boat anchor is up there. So patterns or main point patterns are kind of like that. They already exist, and what you do is you pick it and then you get it sort of tailored to your speech, and you pick it and stick it. Very similar to that. And then obviously, as you get more creative and you get better at speaking, we learn to modify or let go of our patterns. But I will tell you, when I'm asked to give a speech, I kind of initially panic almost every time. Even though I'm very well practiced at this, I still panic a little bit because like, oh, I have to give this speech and it makes me nervous. And then when I sit down to write the speech, I feel blank at first. I always feel a little bit blank, like, oh, I don't know what to do. And so what I do is I go back to these standard patterns. I go back to the things that I know. And I start writing my speech there using standard main point structures. And then after I've done that, I can now start to get a little bit more creative with it. And I usually make a lot of changes. And so it doesn't end up looking very standardized, but it usually starts there. And that's what the point of a public speaking class is, so that when you are in life doing the life public speaking, you have some tools to start from, and then you're going to modify them and make them your own. But if you don't have any tools to start from, it's really hard to modify. So that's what this class is a bunch of tools. And this organizational process that we're talking about is a standard tool. And you can always start with the standard tool and then modify as you get more comfortable and more confident. All right, so between each main point is what we call a transition statement. A transition statement helps the audience follow the speech. And that's why I love this picture here of this American Ninja Warrior, right? This is my transition picture, because this is one main point, right? And then this is her headed to the next main point. Right? And the transition sentence is the moment sort of in between where you say, hey, now that I've finished telling you about one section of my speech, I'm going to move on to the next section of my speech. And so a transition sentence happens at the end of the introduction when you're like, okay, so now let's talk about this first main point, which is blank. And then it happens at the end of each main point. Now that I've talked about how the Constitution is of the people, let's talk about how it's for the people. Okay. So it happens at the end of each main point, and it literally says, here's what I've just finished. Now let's start the next part. So a full transition statement includes the main point that you just finished and the main point that you're headed into. All right, it is both parts, right? So it's part 1 and part 2. That is a completed transition statement. When we just say, now let's talk about the second thing, it makes it harder for our audience to remember what we just finished and why one thing might logically relate to the next. All right, so transition statements help us maintain a clear organizational feeling in the speech, and they help the audience remember what your main points are. Okay, so this is a sample speech outline for just the body of the speech. And as you can see, it's here was our Roman numeral up here for the body of the speech. And then each of the main points is its own area, right? A, B, C are main point 1. And then beneath them are the subpoints. And the subpoints are information related to the main point. So as you can see, here we have main point 1, logistics. And this speech is about why you should visit the president's office hours, the college president's office hours. So logistics, and then all the subpoints are related to logistics, right? Like, oh, it happens once a month, all year. It's always Tuesday from 2 to 3 p.m. And it's in room 224. And now we have a transition sentence, right? And I would actually probably write out my transition sentence so that I could remember it until I got good at transition sentences, and then I don't need them anymore. Or I don't need to write them anymore. I always need a transition sentence. So now that we've talked about the logistics of office hours, let's talk about why the president hosts those. And now I have more subpoints. Oh, it encourages communication, strengthens teamwork across the campus. And I might have several examples of how teamwork has been strengthened across the campus because of office hours. All right. And then I transition again. Okay, so now that we've talked about why the president does it, let's talk about why you should go to those office hours. Okay, and now again, my sub points, right? Oh, well, you should ask questions, anything that you care about, the future of the school, career pathways, DACA. You should push issues, right? Like, oh, prerequisites. Should we have to take all of these prerequisites? What should be in the guided pathways programs, right? Anything that you think is really important on campus. Like our campus uses styrofoam. It just drives me nuts. So I would love to get rid of that. Anyways, these are all reasons that maybe you should go. And I'm sure you can think of other things that would be subpoints here. And then again, we transition. So now that I've talked to you about why we should go, let's conclude this speech, right? And we transition into our conclusion. Okay, very good. So this is what the sample of the body looks like when you're writing a speaking or speech outline. And that will make more sense to you when you listen to the outlining lecture.